of you have had your Christmas? It's kind of a interesting phrase we use, had your Christmas, right? It really just means something like you've had your tradition, you've done your tradition of opening up presents and exchanging gifts and so forth. One of our typical traditions at Christmas time is the list. You know the list. Santa has his list of those who have been naughty or nice. And we, especially our children, have a list of things that we want for Christmas. Now, sometimes that list is rather difficult to write. There was this mobster's son, and he was sitting at his desk one cold December day, writing a Christmas list to Jesus. I guess he decided to bypass Santa and go straight to the top. So it's a Christmas list to Jesus. He first writes, "Dear baby Jesus, I've been a good boy the whole year, so I want a new..." He looks at the paper, then crumbles it up into a ball, and he throws it away. He gets out a new piece of paper and tries again. "Dear baby Jesus, I've been a good boy for most of the year, so I want a new..." Again, he looks at the list with what he wrote with disgust, and he throws it away. So then he gets an idea. He goes into his mother's room, takes the statue of the Virgin Mary, puts it in the closet, and locks the door. He takes another piece of paper and writes, "Dear baby Jesus, if you ever want to see your mother again..." Now, let's not forget that Jesus actually had a mother, a flesh and blood human mother. He shared his DNA with his mother. Now, of course, no one knew anything about genetics in Jesus' day. It wasn't until the late 1800s that the first DNA molecule was isolated. And it wasn't until the 1950s until Watson and Crick figured out the structure of DNA. And no, I'm not related to Dr. Crick. I'm sure even Watson and Crick could never have predicted how much we would have progressed in our understanding of genetics in the last half century or so. From the Human Genome Project that was finally completed back in 2003, to those DNA tests that you can order online to understand your heritage and so forth. Speaking of Christmas lists, well, this year Annie and I decided that we would order one of those online DNA tests that you see advertised on television. This is for our Christmas to one another. And because we want to discover where all that we came from, where is our places of origin. We want to know what our predominant bloodline really is. But again, our knowledge of genetics is beyond anything anyone could have imagined. Even 100 years ago, we now know that we inherit DNA from both of our parents, mother and father. Well, guess what? The biblical writers had no knowledge of that whatsoever. Now, I'm sure they noticed that children tend to resemble their parents, but they didn't understand why. And they may have figured out on some rudimentary level that the biological connection between the father's seed and the reproduction of children, and yet they had no knowledge of the female egg. So women were just thought to be carriers of babies. They were just the carriers. That was it. Now, this is important to note as we reflect on what the New Testament has to say about Jesus. To make a long story short, Jesus' father was God, which in their minds was the only relevant parent. I'm talking about the biblical writers. That was the only relevant parent, because the mother was thought to be only a carrier of God's Son. Then this child, whose father is God, did not inherit the stain of humanity. That is the sinful nature of humanity, which they believed, again, came only through the fathers. Are you staying with me here? This is why Mary's sinful humanity was never an issue, was never really an issue until scientists convinced the church that both parents have a biological role in the reproduction of children. Now, get that. They never worried about Mary's sinful human nature and how that might affect Jesus until scientists told them, well, we inherit DNA from both, or we inherit what we get from both father and mother. Because of that, the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception became official in the mid-1800s in the Catholic Church. Now, this is the doctrine. I know a lot of people think the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception is referring to Jesus' sinless birth. No. It's referring to Mary's sinless birth. That basically, Immaculate Conception says Mary was sinless in her nature, and therefore, so was her offspring. But again, none of this was known when the New Testament was written. Therefore, in the letter to the Hebrews, which we heard a moment ago, the writer is able to basically ignore Mary's humanity and claim Jesus' connection to God the Father by calling Jesus, and I love this phrase, I chose it for my sermon title, the exact imprint of God's very being. Think how that sounds, the exact imprint of God's very being. Today, if we heard something like that, we might think that they're talking about cloning. And yet we know that cloning was a foreign concept to the writer of Hebrews. But even in unscientific terms, this is a startling claim that a man born of a woman is, as the writer also says in Hebrews, the reflection of God's glory. Now, all of this kind of makes me wonder what would be said about God's son or God's child if this story was unfolding in our modern scientific world. Let's say nothing like Jesus happened 2,000 years ago, but it's happening right now. What would be going on? Certainly Jesus, or whatever name, whatever this person would be named, he or a she, who knows. Certainly this person would have undergone a DNA test. That's the first thing we would do. If somebody's claiming to be half human, half God, or however you want to put it, we would say, well, you got to take a DNA test. And of course, unless we could discover what divine DNA looks like, I'm not sure our test would confirm anything that was useful for our purposes. But we don't need to go off into that, too much speculation. Thinking about Jesus as a genetic reflection of God also makes our reading from John a bit more interesting. Now think about, again, I don't mean to bore you, but think about our scientific understanding of genetics. Scientists have determined that our genetic makeup, our genotype, is based on a series of combinations of 4 nucleic acid bases that are represented by 4 letters. A, C, G, and T. Now, please don't ask me to explain that. I'm just mimicking what I've heard. But in other words, we use letters to explain our genetic makeup. We use letters to do that. So with that in mind, listen again to John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, I realize John was not a geneticist, and yet it's interesting that he is linking Jesus to the Creator by referring to him as the Word. And words require letters. I just found that interesting. So both the writer of Hebrews and John's Gospel are really just trying to say the same thing. We could overthink this and analyze it till the cows come home. But this is what they're trying to say. When we see Jesus, we see God. When we think of Jesus, we're thinking of God. Jesus is the exact imprint, the genetic clone, the spiritual offspring, the Word, and the Son of God. And we can get cute with all that by playing around with words and concepts and scientific theories like I just did. And yet, at the end of the day, the Christian witness is that when we look at Jesus, we are looking at a reflection of God's glory. And that's why we are celebrating his birthday today. Although his birthday really wasn't historically on December 25th. The point is not the date. The point is that he was worthy of celebration. So let's celebrate.